Top of the morning to you and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Elections in Russian-controlled Ukraine could be cancelled. Two killed in Russian drone strike on northern Ukrainian city, while residential building suffers heavy damage. Plus, Ukraine crisis, AI on the agenda for UK Security Council presidency. Thank you for joining us. Now, if the situation worsens in 4 Russian-controlled parts of Ukraine, local elections scheduled there for September will be cancelled. That's according to Russia's top election official, Ella Pamfilova, who chairs Russia's Central Election Commission. Pamfilova was addressing President Vladimir Putin, who replied, "Understood." Russia controls just under 1/5 of Ukraine, including Crimea, which it annexed in 2014, and parts of 4 other regions that Russian troops have taken control of since the current military conflict began in February 2022. President Vladimir Putin says the regions Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson are now part of Russia after Moscow unilaterally annexed them last year. Ukraine says the annexation is illegal and void, and that it will not rest until every last Russian soldier is ejected from its internationally recognized territory. The front line of the conflict, which Moscow calls a special military operation, runs through all 4 regions. The death toll has risen to 3, while several others were wounded in a Russian drone attack on the northern Ukrainian city of Sumy. The Sumy Regional Administration says an official building and 2 residential buildings were damaged in an attack carried out with 4 drones. Footage shows an object flying low over Sumy city center and going down, after which an explosion could be heard, closely followed by a second explosion. Kiev's military had earlier reported shooting down 13 of 17 Iranian-made Shahed drones launched by Moscow overnight in a separate attack on several parts of the country. Meanwhile, the Sumy attack that occurred on Monday, and the Ukrainian initially reported 1, then 2 fatalities, releasing footage on the messaging app Telegram showing mangled buildings and courtyards scattered with debris as rescue workers tackled a fire. In total, 1 official building and 2 residential buildings were damaged in an attack carried out with 4 drones. Another air raid alert was declared in the Sumy region several hours after the morning strike, with the Ukrainian Air Force warning that more drones could be on the way. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is warning that Ukraine's air defenses are not yet sufficient enough to protect itself from Russian attacks. He also accuses the government of Georgia of compromising Ukrainian citizen Mikhail Saakashvili. According to him, a person's life is of the highest value, and they could not allow Mikhail to be simply eliminated.
Unfortunately, our state does not have a sufficient number of high-quality air defense systems to protect our entire territory and shoot down all enemy targets. The enemy takes advantage of this, as they did today by launching another terrorist attack on the city of Sumy, using an Iranian drone, targeting, in particular, residential buildings and the building of the security service of Ukraine.
Доповідав генерал Болищук, командувач повітряних сил.
President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. The Russia-Ukraine conflict, meanwhile, and risks by artificial intelligence, AI, are high on the agenda for UK Security Council July presidency. Now, the permanent representative of the United Kingdom to the United Nations and president of the Security Council for July 2023, told reporters that the mission will also push to expand the permanent seat in the council to include India, Brazil, Germany, Japan, and African representation. Asked about the renewal of the Black Sea Grain Deal initiative, United Kingdom Ambassador to the United Nations, Barbara Woodward, said she was not very confident and accused Russia of playing brinkmanship with the food on people's tables and around the world. On Saturday, July the 1st, the UK officially took over the rotating presidency of the UN Security Council for the month of July, succeeding the United Arab Emirates.
I'd like to set this in the context of the speech in multilateralism that my foreign minister gave last week. And in that speech, he announced the UK's ambition to drive forward reform of the multilateral system. And our presidency in July marks the first step in that process. We want to see expansion of the Council's permanent seats to include India, Brazil, Germany and Japan and African representation. It's high time the Council entered the 2020s. This is going to take a global effort. So on technology, during our presidency, we'll be bringing artificial intelligence to the Security Council for the very first time with our signature event this month. Many of you will know that as humanity stands on the precipice of this gigantic technological leap forward, we want to encourage a multilateral approach to managing both the huge opportunities and the risks that artificial intelligence holds for all of us, including its implications for international peace and security. So we'll use our presidency to ensure the truth is heard about Russia's war crimes, and once again urge Russia to end the war so Ukraine can return to peace and start to rebuild. We support all efforts by our friends and partners around the world towards peace. But the only one with the power to end the war tomorrow is President Putin. And until then, we will proudly and rightly support Ukraine to defend itself against Russia's unprovoked invasion.
Meanwhile, President Vladimir Zelensky has asked U.S. President Joe Biden to invite Ukraine into NATO now, even if membership does not come until after the war. President Zelensky added that Biden was the decision maker about whether Ukraine will be in NATO or not. Ukraine's aspiration to join is enshrined in its constitution, and its relationship with NATO dates back to the early 1990s. According to the alliance, NATO is due to hold a summit in Lithuania on July the 11th and 12th, where leaders are expected to discuss Ukraine's membership. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey is reiterating that Turkey will not lift its opposition to Sweden joining NATO unless the Nordic country stops harboring groups Ankara considers to be terrorists. Now, in recent months, demonstrators in Stockholm waved flags showing support for the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, which is also deemed a terrorist group by Turkey's Western allies, including Sweden. The U.S. ambassador to Russia, Lynn Tracy, has met jailed Wall Street Journal reporter Ivan Gershkovich at the Lefortovo prison in Moscow, in the second such visit since his pre-trial detention in March on espionage charges. Russia has said Gershkovich was caught trying to obtain military secrets while on a trip to the Russian city of Yekaterinburg, but has provided no details supporting that assertion. The Wall Street Journal denies the allegations. And the family of jailed Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny has filed a class action lawsuit against the penal colony where he has been held over its refusal to allow him visits from them. In a statement on his Twitter channel, which is controlled by his lawyers and allies, he says they are determined to go all the way to the Constitutional Court. Navalny has filed numerous complaints against the penal colony since his imprisonment, all of which have been rejected so far. We now speak to Mr. Chidi Nwanu, a security expert, joining us from out of London. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
The rotating presidency of the UN Security Council, which now falls in the lap of the UK, what do you think it holds for the conflict in Ukraine? And now this talk of AI and what it brings to bear on world politics, how much of a danger is it? And could AI, artificial intelligence, could anyway be used for nefarious purposes in this Ukraine conflict?
So, I mean, in the first instance, the UK taking over the chairmanship of the Security Council, I mean, it's more or less a routine affair. Every state will take control. Every state that's a member will take control, and particularly any member who's a P5. You're most likely going to see more, what I would say grandstanding, more, statements in support of Ukraine, more actions in support of Ukraine, but there'll be no practical effect because Russia has a veto. So there's nothing that the UK is going to do in the Security Council that, is going to be different from anything else. It's just going to be maybe more meetings and more, discussions, favoring Ukraine and trying to generate a buzz around that. In terms of AI, I mean, it's a new technology. I wouldn't pretend to be an expert on it, but any new technology can be used for good or for ill. So, the same way a radar can be used to make flight safe, but it can also be used to guide missiles. It can be used to make atomic weapons, or it can be used to generate cheap electricity. So AI will have many applications. And as I said, this is definitely not my field of expertise, so I can't pretend to think of what they would be specifically for this conflict or even for other conflicts. But the ability to compute, to create false narratives, fake pictures, things like that. There's so many possibilities. Even just as a staff officer, one of the jokes is that AI will be able to write battle orders or plans better than most staff officers. So the applications are unknown, but it's important that the world starts, looking at this technology early on and getting a handle on it. So what will be key, or the most important, link that I see from my perspective between the Ukraine war, AI, and this search for a regulatory framework is whether all the parties put their differences to one side and work towards a common solution. Or everybody stands to lose, everybody stands to gain. So unless one element or one power has an advantage in AI that they want to exploit, it's likely that all powers would like to work together. So will be interesting to see is whether all of these, whether all the members of the Security Council will put their differences to one side and work towards a regulatory framework, or whether they will still continue with their divisions as per the Ukraine war and other issues. I mean, just as a final point, that an interesting example of this is the Iran nuclear deal. Now, that's obviously fallen to the wayside. But at that point, even though Russia and China had differences with the US, UK, France, all these parties worked together to deliver that deal. So it will be interesting to see if that happens now, and that will be a good indication of how the planet is going to be managing its affairs.
Don't worry, Mr. Nwanu. AI is virgin territory for many of us, but just think about it. If deep fakes that have been used entertainment-wise can be used in a more professional and evil way, as you've mentioned, propaganda-wise, to do those sorts of things and generate images that are untrue, to communicate messages that are untrue as well. If these nations see artificial intelligence as something as important as nuclear technology, and the United States were the first to use a nuclear bomb, or space exploration, and we know who put the first man on the moon, then maybe it's something that options are still open and on the table for the United Nations to build this regulatory framework in a transparent manner so as to have a level playing field for all countries concerned.
Yes, and that's exactly the point, in that all of these technologies that we've just mentioned, they all kind of came out in silos. So if we think back to the world before 1945, before 1939, it was a series of protectionist blocs. Now, even after 1945, when we had, the Warsaw Pact and, the West, in conflict, you had to, blocks, but, the world started opening up. There was within the Warsaw Pact, there was, a very weird form of monetary union and a weird form of an economic union. And then within the West, you had the EU and all the economic union of Europe at that point, and the rest of the world opening up to globalization. So we're now in a world where things are much, where everything is about cooperation. Our supply chains are massively interlinked. It's a huge supply chain of getting maybe coltan out of Congo all the way to China to getting your iPhone, in Nigeria. Mm-hmm. All of those things are interlinked. So it's a different world, and we need a different set of kind of rules and a different way of looking at things. And so one will hope, and it's a massive hope, that the major powers in the world will put their differences to one side and work out a way to kind of regulate this. But the more important thing is powers like Nigeria. Now, we don't have a dog in this fight right now. Smaller countries, because we haven't, advanced to that level. But at some point, it will affect us. So it's very important for countries, like Nigeria or Africa, the African Union, to kind of set out our stall as well and make sure that, as has happened with, the economic situation in the world, the rules aren't written by the people who are in the best place to take advantage of them. We are able to, have our input and look at it and say, this is where we fit in, rather than just, waiting for crumbs at the table, or when everything's been decided, complaining that it's not fair. It's a very important point that, and this is what I'm trying to emphasize, is that whether the world is going to progress and use this technology properly is going to be very much dependent on whether the major powers, the people who control this technology and have the best understanding of it, are able to put aside the differences, about Ukraine, trade, whatever it is, and work towards a solution. And also whether we, as in, the less developed countries, are able to also make sure we have, a place at that table, and we have a point that we need to get across as well.
Indeed, transparency is key. Remember the cloning, human cloning, and cloning in general, and the cloning of Dolly and all the secrecy surrounding that. Well, but let's leave that for a second and go to NATO's membership by Ukraine, for which President Zelensky, we have reported this morning, says the United States have a lot to say about it. Is this true? Is he ascribing too much importance to how much of an influence their bid for NATO will have? He says that they should be invited by NATO, and the United States has a lot to do in that regard, but they know that membership is not realistic for them right now.
I think, the NATO argument is kind of, I wouldn't say it's passé, but it's everybody understands the reality of it. Everybody understands that Ukraine is not joining NATO anytime soon. Until this war is finished, until the status of Crimea is settled, Ukraine will never join NATO. The best that Ukraine is going to get is some sort of partnership for peace with NATO, and most likely bilateral security guarantees. That's the best. So I kind of, at this point, a lot of these conversations around NATO, I would just say it's a way of the Ukrainians in particular maintaining pressure on their Western partners. They know that it's a sore point. They know that it's a way of annoying the Russians, and it's also a way of them making sure that in whatever peace negotiation ends this war, that their right to join NATO or the EU or any other organization is not abrogated away. So by trying to link the United States into it, they're trying to get an additional guarantee. If you recall, joining the EU, joining the NATO is part of the Ukrainian constitution. It's something that they have decided they want to do as a nation. So I think all of this is, I would say, is kind of background noise to kind of keep, to keep a conversation going. But it's also, the strategic element is that they want to make sure that if there is going to be a peace there will be a peace negotiation, that their right to form alliances, be it with NATO, in NATO, around NATO, is not signed away. And by getting the United States to sign onto it, they think that will help. In reality, it doesn't, because every NATO country has a veto, as we've seen with Sweden. Turkey has vetoed their membership. Any country could veto Ukraine's membership, be it Hungary, whatever. And the US could have a new president next year who would veto Ukraine's membership anyway. So it's a moot point, but it just, it helps keep, that issue in the spotlight for the Ukrainians.
In the same vein, and you preempted my next question, why is Sweden maintaining its decision to go after its NATO membership when it knows that it's not clear the air with Turkey, who, as you correctly reminded us, have vetoed their membership because of Turkey's allegations that Sweden is harboring elements that are anti-Turkey?
So there's two points there. There's two key issues. The first issue is the operational issue, in that Sweden and Finland, their defense kind of plans or the defense strategy are quite interlinked. Both of them, the defense of one is somewhat dependent on the defense of the other. So one being in and one being out, it creates a dissymmetry, and asymmetry is a difficult kind of issue for their planners. In a real war situation, they'll find a way to get around it. I'm fairly sure. I'm fairly sure there will be some bilateral kind of situation where if Sweden is attacked, Finland might come to defend them, and so on. But from that point of view, I mean, without going into the details, they have that problem. Their entire war planning was based on both of those countries being somewhat integrated in their defense. And the issue was that this was previously predicated upon their neutrality. So this is why both of them have to join NATO together or stay out of it together. Their neutrality vis-a-vis Russia and NATO was an issue that they kind of based their entire defense structure around. Now that one is in NATO and one is out, as I said, it creates that kind of disconnect. The second issue is that Sweden's principles are very much around, welcoming refugees, protecting the politically persecuted. They cannot be seen to put that to one side or to bow to pressure from Turkey in order to gain NATO membership. So you've kind of got a rock on a hard place. They're hoping to negotiate their way out of it. Unfortunately, you have a lot of people who are again taking advantage of Swedish law to create publicity stunts like burning Korans to further create problems for Sweden. So it's a kind of an issue that I believe eventually will be negotiated out. But, the Swedes will need to find a way to, if not expel the PKK, but, put them in a certain, show some sort of negative action towards them to keep the Turks happy. And the Turks will obviously have to modify their request for the PKK to be expelled. But it's a difficult one because the Swedes cannot abrogate on their long-held values, and they also cannot rewrite their entire defense plans, defense strategy to kind of fight a battle by themselves. Now, just the final point on that is that Sweden is actually really well situated to fight, the kind of war that Ukraine is fighting. Everything is designed around, the center being destroyed. Everything is, kind of disconnected. Their key fighter, the Gripen, is designed to operate off roads, all of that kind of stuff. But it still will not be able to fight a long, deep, sustained war without, that alliance with Finland and also the deep support that you get from NATO.
Always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your insight, Mr. Chidinwanu, a security expert who joined us from out of London. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Coming up, Center opens to build cases against Russian leaders for Ukraine aggression. Please stay with us. Welcome to the sophomore stretch of our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Law enforcement officials from Ukraine, the European Union, and the United States have opened an international center to build cases against the Russian leadership for the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainian authorities are reviewing more than 93,000 reports of war crimes and have filed charges against 207 suspects in domestic courts. High-level perpetrators could be tried at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, which has already sought the arrest of Russian President Vladimir Putin. But due to a gap in international law, there is no court that can currently prosecute the crime of aggression for the February 24, 2022 invasion itself. The new International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression, ICPA, also in The Hague, will work alongside the ICC the world's permanent war crimes court and bridge that legal gap.
The key purpose of having the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression is to secure crucial evidence. Start building up the case already now. We don't want to wait until the end of the conflict. We decided that we will support our partners which started their own national investigations, and we will centralize already available evidence, analyze that evidence, and also identify possible evidentiary gaps through our experts working here at Eurojust.
Today, we gather here on occasion of a truly historic moment. I would say an epoch-defining moment when the civilized world not only voices, but also shows by concrete actions that accountability is what matters the most. The work of the Center will contribute to the efficient and comprehensive investigation and prosecution of the crime of aggression, which is an original sin, commission of which opened the floodgate for 100,000 of other international crimes.
The Justice Department's newly appointed U.S. Special Prosecutor for the Crime of Aggression, Jessica Kim, will represent the United States at the Center, and she will have unfettered access to the substantial body of expertise and resources that the department has amassed in response to Russia's unlawful war of aggression against the people of Ukraine.
The investigators and prosecutors of Ukraine and men and women of my office are working in a battle zone in a way that presents unique challenges. But unless we collect and preserve the evidence, the hope of accountability that is as wide as possible for as many core crimes under the Rome Statute as possible will become theoretical and illusionary. And of course, whether it's human rights or the Rome Statute, what we're trying to do collectively is make sure these concepts are rendered practical and effective. They're taken off the page of academic journals and are there, plant the flag of justice on the soil of Ukraine and actually spread it more widely as well.
The Kremlin has dismissed allegations by the United Nations that Russia had violated children's rights in Ukraine and said that, on the contrary, its armed forces were rescuing children from conflict zones. One report released on Tuesday accused Russia of detaining more than 800 civilians, some of them children, and of executing 77 civilians since the conflict began in February of last year. In another report commissioned by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres for the UN Security Council and published last week, Russia stands accused of having killed 136 children in 2022. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told a regular briefing that Moscow firmly rejects such accusations. Tuesday's 36-page UN report, that's today, based on 70 visits to detention centers and more than 1,000 interviews, also said that Ukraine had violated international law by arbitrarily detaining civilians, but on a considerably smaller scale. The head of the International Committee in the Federation Council, Russia's upper house of the parliament, Grigory Karasin, has gone further to say Russia has brought about 700,000 children from the conflict zones in Ukraine into Russian territory. Karasin, who wrote on his Telegram messaging channel, added that Moscow's program of bringing children from Ukraine into Russian territory is to protect orphans and children abandoned in conflict zones. Ukraine and the United States says children have been illegally deported and forcibly removed from their homes. Now, the Kremlin says that all government agencies and ministries, including the intelligence services, have been working as they should in the context of an aborted armed mutiny by mercenary fighters Wagner on June the 24th. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov declined to comment when asked why the FSB security services had not headed the mutiny off before it began. However, but said society and the armed forces had rallied behind President Vladimir Putin at the time. In his response, asked why state funds had been used to finance the Wagner mercenary group that mutinied, Peskov declined to comment. Now, we'd like to speak with Professor David Aurawo, the head of the Department of History and Strategic Studies, University of Lagos, Southwest Nigeria. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
It's hard to hold brief for Russia in the case where, though they say, and it's possibly very tenable because Russia will not kill children. Will they deliberately target children? Will they forcibly kidnap children from their mothers and their fathers and take them to Russia and what have you? Speaking from a neutral point of view for onlookers into this conflict. But in the case where they invaded another country, call it a special military operation, and invariably are presented with situations where there are children who are orphans, there are children who've been abandoned, there are children whose parents are nowhere to be found, and they take those children back to Russia. Why not have them taken into Kiev instead? So could we begin by asking what your opinion is in Russia's denial that they have killed children and that they have kidnapped and taken children forcibly into Russia?
Well, Russia has been trying to make a defense, present an apologia for its action of taking children in large numbers, many of them, into Russia. They claim that these children are orphans and they are taking them for protection. Is not altogether correct because many of them are not orphans. And just like you said, if the orphans among them, when they are picked up, why are they not handed over to Ukrainian authorities? Even though there is war, I mean, there are channels of discussion, and then there have been exchanges of, captured active military personnel.
Indeed.
Why are these children taken away? Why are they not, handed over to the authorities in Ukraine? There is an element of indoctrination that Russia tries to carry out. And many of these children are apparently taken away to be indoctrinated, to be taught the Russian way and indoctrinated, those things are there. So it is not altogether true and correct. The claim by Russia that the reason it has taken those children just for safekeeping and for protection, and that they will be returned. Of course, some have been returned, and those have been returned with some of the concession too granted by Ukraine. So it's almost like capturing war criminals, capturing active military personnel as well. They capture them and they use them to bargain for something. So it's not altogether true that the Russia's position that the children that have been taken to Russia are taken to Russia because they are orphans and have been taken so that they will be safe in Russia.
Professor, the United Nations has always had a difficult task when that great an organization with that ambitious a proposition to unite countries around the world with different languages and different cultures tries to do that. Many cases, they're accused of many things. In the case of the Ukraine conflict, now with the chairmanship of the UK, of the UN Security Council, give us your overview of how well the United Nations has handled this conflict, because it's in their purview, and whether they've done as well as they should have done or could have done.
Well, if you read the UN Charter, Articles 1 and 2, the objectives are clearly stated, and preventing the outbreak of war is a major objective of the United Nations, and resolving conflicts when they break out is another. In fact, the first couple of paragraphs of the first article outline all of this. The fact that the war broke out in the first place, it means that Russia has not done, the UN has not done well, and that the war broke out, 24th of February last year. It's dragged on for well over a year now, and the intervention of the United Nations leading to resolution, a quick resolution, is not cannot be seen anywhere yet. So it is very clear that the UN hasn't done nearly enough to resolve this conflict. It is very clear. The few things that's on here and there, negotiating, for instance, the grain export from Russia and Ukraine, from Ukraine, where it's a positive, and a few things here and there. But overall, even the United Nations Secretary General himself and the others in the United Nations will admit that the UN has not done well, in efforts to prevent the outbreak of this conflict and efforts to resolve it since it broke out well over a year ago. There will always be accusations against the United Nations that, United Nations is taking sides with Ukraine or the here and there and all that. But the UN is operating within a framework, and one can understand why it is so. If a United Nations Secretary General, long ago said that the United Nations is the world in microcosm. So if the UN fails, it is the world itself actually that has failed. The UN can only do as much as the global system, the countries that are member states, give it support. So one can understand that the overall assessment is that the UN has not, done well, has not lived up to expectation in intervention to try to resolve this conflict.
What about the European Union then?
The EU it looks like a party to the conflict itself. The EU support for Ukraine is clear, just like NATO has also given extensive support to Ukraine. Most EU members are also NATO members. EU, NATO, their involvement is along the same trajectory. And so one would even think that the EU has operated within more along the line of its objectives in this conflict than the UN has done. The EU is a regional organization. Russia is not a member. It stands for protection of human rights, sovereignty of states and all that. Yeah. It has tried to work along that line to, in its support it has given to Ukraine so far in the course of the war. But what one expects is that some member states of the EU that are close to both Ukraine and Russia, like for instance, France. I would have expected France to do a lot more than it has done in trying to bring this conflict to an end. When Emmanuel Macron went to China, for instance, a couple of weeks ago, one was thinking that he would present a peace plan, just like China presented one that was too much pro-Russia, that France will have tried to present another one that will stay in middle position, and that might be a basis for moving forward with negotiations to end the conflict. But Emmanuel Macron just veered off into economic issues, talked for a while, and praised China and left. So the EU has done fairly well, but individual countries within the EU that are close to both Russia and Ukraine, and that have not been so extreme in their position, that Russia can trust and Ukraine can trust, one would have expected them to do a lot more in trying to put something forward that will bring parties to negotiation to end the war, more than they have done so far. But if you ask me, I would say the EU has even done a lot better than the United Nations, considering you can only judge an organization in line with the objectives for which they were established. And when you look at the UN and the EU, you say the EU has kept more to its objectives than the United Nations has done as far as this conflict is concerned.
In seeking the resolution of this conflict, Professor, and the positioning of the various world powers, are there more self-centered interests at play where, for instance, China was visited by the U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken without an invitation, knowing that China and the U.S. have issues with each other. However, China is an ally of Ukraine. India, the President Narendra Modi visits U.S. President Joe Biden, knowing that India is the one that have been buying Russian oil and giving Russia a get-out-of-jail card, with evading some of the sanctions that the collective world powers have been imposing on Russia. India is doing that. So could you give us your impression of how the world powers are positioning themselves. In the case of China, where, for instance, we had Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the senators in the U.S. Congress, complaining that China, for instance, is a naval superpower, and they have about 400 warships, over 400 warships, well in excess of what the United States has, about 200 plus. So these nations, and China at the same time seems to be gaining more ground and more influence across the board. So can you tell us what your impression is and what the motives of some of these countries really are?
Well, there is a theory of international relations that is called complex interdependence. There are multiple layers of interaction in the international system. When Blinken went to China, he didn't go for a Russia-Ukraine matter. He went to see how the increasing conflict between China and United States could be, tackled, could be handled, such that it does not further, exacerbate the negative impact on the global economy, and so that both economies can benefit. Even the one I made reference to earlier, when Macron visited China, it was more of something of economic, for the economic interest of France. He only made tangential reference to, the Russia-Ukraine conflict and all. So all of these countries are acting in line with their respective national interests, and according to the various channels of, interaction that are available to them. The Russia-Ukraine war is only talked about, only as far as countries are interested in bringing the conflict to an end. When the Indian Prime Minister went to the United States, there are so many other issues, affecting the United States and India that the Indian Prime Minister and United States, President had to address, away from the, Russia-Ukraine war. They only talk about, the Russia-Ukraine war as far as where it impinges on their interests or it concerns their, talking about global stability. Within this context, we can understand the Prime Minister of India going to United States, despite the fact that India is pro-China, is pro-Russia in this matter, and the United States, of course, is the strongest supporter of Ukraine on the matter as well. Just also as Anthony Blinken went to China, and even though China is a strong ally of Russia, and the United States is one of the greatest supporters of Ukraine. So there are multiple channels and layers of interaction. And of course, there are diverse issues that these countries, are interacting on and discussing on. But what we are saying is that while all of these layers, web of interactions are going on, attention should be paid to this Russia-Ukraine war that has the capacity to further destabilize the international system and negatively also affect the global economy, as we have already seen. And of course, with all the humanitarian challenges that this has posed to the global system. That is the point we are making. Otherwise, countries will continue to interact at different levels, address issues that concern them, and talk about Russia-Ukraine war only as far as they want to talk about global stability.
Thank you so much. But finally, is there a danger of double standards? These same countries are harsh critics of other countries who seem to be neutral or not totally against Russia, such as Hungary, harshly criticized by the United States. In extreme cases, North Korea, Cuba, harshly criticized by the allies of Ukraine.
Yeah, not really double standards. It's a matter of interest. Just look at the case of United States and Pakistan, for instance. Before 9/11, the U.S. was against Pakistan. When Musharraf was there, it was not, a civilian leader at the state. But after that invasion of, after the terrorist attack on the United States 9/11, the U.S. became a friend of Pakistan because of interest. So it's not double standard. It's just a matter of interest and the changing circumstances of developments in these countries.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your time, making out the time to be with us this morning. Always a pleasure. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much.
Professor David Aurawo, HOD, History and Strategic Studies, University of Lagos. Now, Time for another break, and when we return, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky urges Georgia to release ex-President Mikhail Saakashvili for treatment. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. We're in the final stretch of our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine for today. The European Union is considering a proposal for the Russian Agricultural Bank to set up a subsidiary to reconnect to the global financial network. Now, according to the Financial Times, the move aims to safeguard the Black Sea grain deal that allows Ukraine to export food to global markets. Now, the United Nations declined to comment on the report. UN spokesperson Farhan Haq told reporters that UN officials had been in touch with a number of nations, including European nations, to find creative ways in which exports of food and fertilizer from the Russian Federation could be expedited. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz have called for the extension of the deal allowing the safe export of grain and fertilizers from 3 Ukrainian Black Sea ports. Scholz's spokesperson says the two leaders agreed to support the deal extension during a phone conversation. The Kremlin had said that Moscow is pessimistic about the prospects of renewing the deal set to expire on July the 18th because no progress had been made in implementing accompanying agreements that pertain to Russian exports. Now we turn our attention to the world of business and how it's been affected by the Ukraine conflict and vice versa. Our business correspondent, Ini John Mekwa, is with me in the studio for that purpose. Good morning, Ini.
Good morning.
Global oil prices after Russia's proposed cut, what happened to them?
Yeah, so we talked about oil prices and oil revenue that's accruing to Russia last week. So there had been a plan to cut, and a cut from this month, July, from the world's largest, Saudi Arabia. You know, they have the biggest export crude. And so they said they will cut down on their production. Of course, what that means is that it's going to tighten supply. And when supply is tightened, then prices go up. So Russia is now joining them to cut 500,000 barrels per day from next month, August. So what that means is more squeeze on the supply. That's
I like the way you explained it to me.
Yeah.
A, B to the C.
Because I want everybody to understand.
Thank you. Go on.
So when there's more squeeze, obviously, then demand will kind of... In fact, already, prices are going up. Price was up about 0.6%, you know, on the average of both Brent and WTI. Yeah. As at this morning. This is another move from Russia because, you know, if there's more supply, that means the price will go down and their revenue will go down. But now if there's less supply, that means that prices will go up and Russia's revenue will go up. So this is also, they're working along with Saudi Arabia on this to see how prices can be hiked. And then their revenue, you know, will... at the end of the day, increase, at least their oil revenue. Okay, now there's this ambitious plan for Russia to be made to pay for Ukraine's recovery post the conflict. Yeah. United Kingdom wants to force Russia to finance that. Yeah. How feasible is this and what are they doing? Obviously, because, you know, we talked about it, but also remember we talked about that thing in the United States, the Act. Right. In the United States, what's that repo? Remember the repo we talked about? That was from the United States. Yeah. So the UK is actually in support of this, but they know that it will be illegal because you have tens of thousands of dollars of assets Russia's assets, because Russia invests a whole lot in the UK.
In other words, to repossess Russian assets in different countries around the world, and use that to rebuild Ukraine.
Right. That was in the United States. Now we're talking of the UK also trying to follow suit, but they are still looking for legal means to do that, because you don't really have a right as a country just because there's some assets, another country's assets in your country. You don't really have the right to just wake up and, you know, seize their assets and sell them because you want to help another country. It's kind of illegal. So they're discussing legal ways that they could do that, but apparently I don't think they found that yet.
Wondering if we have enough time to talk about the Russian jewelers, Sokolov, who've pivoted to China, by opening a store there.
Yeah, opening a store there, and they hope to open about 20 to 30 by the end of next year. Now, the funny thing about this story is that who are they going to serve? Is it only the Chinese that will buy from that? Doesn't really look like it. Looks like the target is actually Europe. So they wanted to open in Germany, but of course the war came and they couldn't do that. So now they're in China, but they'll have distributors outside of China.
That's where they want to get their jewels, their rubies, their amethyst, their gold.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ini.
Thank you for having me.
More from Ini John Mekwa and Business Morning after this program, so please stay tuned for that. Finally, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called on the Georgian government to transfer the former president of Georgia, Mr. Mikhail Saakashvili, from detention, who's been in prison for more than a year outside the country. Saakashvili is a Ukrainian citizen who served as the head of Zelensky's Executive Committee for Reform, was arrested in 2021 after returning to Georgia and jailed on what he said were trumped-up charges of abuse of office and embezzlement. His health deteriorated severely following 2 hunger strikes. President Zelensky said Saakashvili's prolonged detention amounted to a death sentence. In his words, no government in Europe has the right to execute people. Life is a basic European value. He added that Kiev had summoned the Georgian ambassador to Ukraine to express their strong protest and ask him to leave Ukraine within 48 hours to hold consultations with his capital. That's it on today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Thank you to our guests, thanks to our producers, and thanks to you for watching. Please join us again tomorrow for another edition. I'm Olumide Makoli.